There is a psychological threshold in the world of high-stakes hospitality. It is the moment a customer stops being a guest and starts being a threat. In the jagged, high-contrast underworld of this city, that threat had a name: Marco Bellini. He didn't just command a room, he colonized it with a primal, explosive fury that made world-class chefs fumble their knives and hardened floor managers pray for the end of their shift. Every night at the Iron Petal, the air grew thin around the corner booth. It was a space reserved for the Bellini Storm, a phenomenon where the fine dining atmosphere was regularly shattered by the sound of breaking porcelain and the roar of a man who treated the world like his personal punching bag. Most servers considered it a suicide mission. They saw the ink crawling up his neck, the expensive black suit strained against his muscular frame, and the way his face flushed a dangerous crimson when things weren't perfect. "I'm done, Leo." "I'm actually done," whispered Marcus, a veteran server whose hands were currently vibrating so hard he nearly dropped a silver cloche. He just sent a $300 plate of osso buco flying because the sprig of parsley was too green. "I'm not going back out there. I have a family." Leo, the manager who usually possessed the unflappable calm of a diamond merchant, was currently mopping sweat from his brow with a silk handkerchief. "You have to go back, Marcus," he hissed, his voice cracking with desperation. If the table stays empty, he thinks we're ignoring him. And when Marco Bellini feels ignored, people start disappearing. Standing by the coffee station, watching the chaos with a chilling, porcelain-like stillness, was Rose Bennett. While the rest of the staff moved like they were dodging mortar fire, Rose adjusted her red and white striped sleeves with clinical precision. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a tight, sensible braid, a warrior's preparation disguised as a uniform. She wasn't looking at the exit. She was looking at the reservation book. "I'll take the Storm," Rose said, her voice flat and devoid of the tremor that had infected everyone else. Leo turned, staring at her as if she'd just volunteered to walk into a furnace. "Rose, you've been here 2 weeks. You don't know what he's capable of. He's currently screaming at the wallpaper." "Spent the last 3 years in a house where the silence was louder than his shouting," Rose replied, her eyes as cold as the wine she was about to pour. "A man in a suit throwing a tantrum doesn't scare me. I have real problems." She didn't wait for permission. She grabbed a fresh bottle of red, a clean glass, and walked directly into the center of the hurricane. Hit the subscribe button as we continue this story. The heavy swinging doors of the kitchen usually acted as a barrier against the noise of the dining room, but Marco Bellini's voice pierced through the wood like a serrated blade. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with the smell of seared meat and the metallic tang of fear. Rose didn't hesitate. She picked up a fresh bottle of vintage Barolo and a clean, crystal glass. She didn't check her reflection in the stainless steel prep tables. She didn't need to. Her face was a mask of practiced indifference, a shield she had forged over years of living with a different kind of monster. When she pushed through the doors, the restaurant felt like a funeral parlor. The other diners had gone silent, their heads bowed over their plates as if looking up might draw the predator's attention to them. At the corner booth, Marco Bellini was standing, his towering frame casting a long, jagged shadow over the white linen. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark ink of a hawk's wing stretching across his throat. He was shouting at a spilled puddle of wine, his face a dark, dangerous shade of red. "Is this a joke?" Marco's voice wasn't just loud. It had a vibration to it that made the silverware on neighboring tables rattle. "I asked for the 97. This tastes like vinegar and incompetence." He swiped a hand across the table, sending a bread basket tumbling to the floor. Leo, the manager, was hovering 5 feet away, his hands held up in a placating gesture that only seemed to make Marco angrier. Rose walked into the radius of his fury without slowing her pace. She didn't wait for him to stop shouting. She didn't wait for an opening. She simply stepped between Marco and the trembling busboy who was trying to clean the floor. "Move," she said to the boy. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a flat, undeniable authority. Marco froze. His head snapped toward her, his dark eyes narrowed and bloodshot with rage. He was used to people stuttering, weeping, or fleeing when he raised his voice. He wasn't used to a woman in a striped apron looking at him like he was a mildly inconvenient weather pattern. "Who the hell are you?" Marco growled, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. The scent of expensive cologne and aged whiskey rolled off him. Rose didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. He set the new bottle on the table with a controlled click. "I'm the person bringing you the correct bottle, Mr. Bellini. The 97 you actually ordered. The previous server was mistaken." "I don't care about the bottle anymore," Marco roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The water glasses jumped. "I care about the disrespect. I care about this pathetic excuse for service." Rose picked up the corkscrew. Her hands were perfectly steady. "If you keep shouting, the wine won't breathe properly. And if you keep hitting the table, you're going to break a glass that costs more than your shirt. That would be a waste of everyone's time." Silence that followed was absolute. Leo looked like he was about to faint. A few guests at the bar actually stopped breathing. Marco stared at her, his chest heaving, his large hands bunched into white-knuckled fists. He looked like he was deciding whether to flip the table onto her or admire her neck. "Got a lot of nerve," he whispered, the volume of his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "Do you even know who I am?" Rose met his gaze. Up close, his eyes were a piercing charcoal gray. She saw the tattoos, the scars, and the raw power radiating from him. But she also saw a man having a tantrum, and she had dealt with far worse for far less reward. "I know you're a man who is currently thirsty and making a scene," Rose replied calmly. She deftly peeled the foil from the bottle and spiraled the corkscrew into the wood. "In my world, those are two things I can fix. If you'd like to sit down, I can pour. If you'd like to keep standing, I'll just leave the bottle here and go back to my other tables. They're a much quieter." A long, agonizing heartbeat. Marco didn't move. He looked at her braid, then down at her small, steady hands, and finally back into her emotionless eyes. The tension in his shoulders didn't disappear, but the frantic, explosive edge of his anger seemed to hit a wall. He sat down. He didn't do it gracefully. He sank into the leather booth like a king reclaiming a throne, his eyes never leaving her face. "Pour," he commanded. Rose didn't rush. She poured a small tasting portion, her movement fluid and professional. She waited. Marco picked up the glass. He swirled the wine, his eyes still locked on hers, challenging her to show a single crack in her composure. He took a sip. The silence stretched until it felt heavy enough to bruise. Finally, he set the glass down. "It's better," he muttered. "It's correct." Rose corrected him. She placed the bottle in the marble chiller and turned to walk away. She didn't offer a fake smile. She didn't ask if there was anything else. She simply started to retreat toward the kitchen. "Wait," Marco's voice stopped her. It wasn't a shout this time. It was an invitation. "What's your name?" Rose turned her head just enough to look at him over her shoulder. The red and white of her uniform stood out against the dark shadows of the corner booth. "Rose," she said. "Well, Rose," Marco said, a ghost of a dark, dangerous smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Don't send anyone else back to this table. From now on, you're the only one who touches my glass. Understood?" Rose didn't give him the satisfaction of a nod. "I have other tables, Mr. Bellini. But as long as you stop breaking the furniture, I'll make sure you're taken care of." As she pushed back through the kitchen doors, the adrenaline finally hit her, a cold shiver running down her spine. But her face remained a mask. She grabbed a tray of appetizers for table 12, her mind already moving to the next task. She had survived the hurricane, but she knew the eye of the storm was always the briefest part. Behind her in the dining room, the Bellini Storm had settled into a simmering, watchful quiet. And for the first time in years, Marco Bellini was the one who was curious. The following week, the atmosphere at the Iron Pedal was different. The staff wasn't just panicked, they were expectant. At exactly 8:00 p.m., the heavy brass doors swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marco Bellini walked in, his black silk shirt unbuttoned just enough to show the edges of the tattoos climbing his collarbone. He didn't wait for the hostess. He walked straight to the corner booth, his eyes scanning the floor until they landed on Rose. Leo, the manager, scurried forward, his face pale. "Good evening, Mr. Bellini. We have your usual table ready and Marcus is." "I don't want Marcus," Marco interrupted, his voice a low, gravelly hum that silenced the nearby tables. He didn't look at Leo. He kept his gaze fixed on Rose, who was calmly polishing a glass 10 feet away. "I want her." Rose didn't rush. She finished the glass, set it down, and smoothed her red apron. She could feel the eyes of every waiter on her back, a mixture of pity and awe. She walked over to the booth, stopping just outside the reach of his shadow. "Good evening, Mr. Bellini," she said, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "The 2012 Reserva." Marco leaned back, his massive frame filling the velvet booth. He looked at her with a predator's curiosity, searching for the flinch that never came. "No, tonight I am in a difficult mood, Rose. I want something that isn't on the menu." A vertical tasting of the 1990, 95, and 98 vintages of the Sassicaia, and I want them decanted simultaneously at the table. "Do you think you can handle that without breaking my concentration?" It was a test. It was an expensive, logistical nightmare designed to make a server stumble. To decant 3 vintage wines perfectly while maintaining a conversation with a man who could end a career with a phone call was a task most sommeliers would avoid. "I can handle it," Rose replied. "But the 90 is in the reserve cellar. It will take 4 minutes to retrieve and stabilize. If you can wait that long without throwing the bread, I'll get started." A sharp, barking laugh escaped Marco. It wasn't a friendly sound. It was the sound of a man who had finally found a toy that didn't break on the first squeeze. 4 minutes. Go. For the next hour, Rose lived in a world of controlled precision. She brought out the heavy crystal decanters, her movements fluid and rhythmic. She felt Marco watching her every move, the way her fingers gripped the neck of the bottles, the way she used a candle flame to check for sediment in the vintage glass. He didn't speak. He just watched, his charcoal gray eyes tracking the braid in her hair as she moved around the table. "Too good for this place," Marco said suddenly, breaking the silence just as she poured the third glass. "You move like someone who has spent a lot of time hiding how smart she is." Rose didn't stop pouring. "In this city, Mr. Bellini, being smart is usually a liability. Being efficient is what keeps the lights on." "Efficiency is boring," he countered, leaning forward so that his scent, leather, expensive tobacco, and something sharp like ozone, swirled around her. "I want to know why a woman who isn't afraid of me is working for tips in a red and white striped shirt." "What are you running from?" Rose set the bottle down in the marble chiller. She finally looked him in the eye, meeting his intensity with a blank, impenetrable stare. "I'm not running from anything, I'm working. And right now my work is ensuring you enjoy your wine. Is the 95 to your satisfaction, or should I send it back?" Marco took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "The wine is perfect, but the service is too cold. Sit down." "I'm on shift, Mr. Bellini. I can't sit with customers." "I bought this table for the night. I bought the wine for $5,000. I'm telling you to sit down for 2 minutes." His voice had shifted. The shouting was gone, replaced by a heavy, magnetic command that was far more dangerous. Rose calculated the risk. Leo was watching from the bar, nodding frantically, signaling her to do whatever the man wanted. She sat, keeping her back straight, perched on the very edge of the velvet seat opposite him. "You have a bruise on your wrist," Marco said, his voice dropping an octave. He reached across the table, his large, tattooed hand hovering just inches from her arm. Rose didn't pull away, but she didn't move toward him either. "I hid it on a prep table in the kitchen. It's part of the job." "Liar," Marco whispered. His eyes darkened, the curiosity turning into something sharper, something protective and violent. "That's a finger mark. Someone grabbed you. Was it the manager? Or someone at home?" For a split second, the mask slipped. A flicker of raw, jagged pain crossed Rose's eyes before she shuddered it away. It was enough for a man like Marco. He had spent his life reading the weaknesses of others. He knew the look of a person who lived in a state of constant, quiet war. "It's none of your business," Rose said, her voice slightly tighter than before. She stood up, smoothing her apron once more. "Your steak will be out in 3 minutes. I'll check on your water then." She turned and walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs for the first time. She could feel his gaze burning into her back, no longer just a customer looking at a waitress, but a man looking at a mystery he intended to solve. As she reached the kitchen, she heard the sound of Marco's chair scraping against the floor. He didn't leave, but he signaled his bodyguard, a silent, scarred man near the door, to come closer. Marco whispered something, his eyes still fixed on the swinging kitchen doors where Rose had disappeared. Rose leaned against the cool tile of the kitchen wall, breathing hard. She looked at the faint yellow bruise on her wrist, a remnant of a life she was trying to bury. She had thought Marco Bellini was just a storm she had to weather. She realized now that he wasn't a storm at all. He was a hunter, and he had just picked up her scent. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway hummed with a sterile, relentless energy that Rose felt in her very bones. It was nearly 1 in the morning by the time she stepped off the bus, her feet aching in her sensible work shoes, the smell of Marco Bellini's expensive tobacco still clinging to the fibers of her red and white striped shirt. She didn't head home to her cramped apartment. Instead, she walked through the sliding glass doors of the pediatric wing, her badge clipped to her waist like a heavy weight. Room 412 was quiet, bathed in the soft blue glow of monitors that beeped in a rhythmic, fragile cadence. Rose slipped inside, her movements practiced and silent. On the bed lay her 7-year-old daughter, Chloe. The girl's blonde hair was fanned out against the white pillowcase, her skin so pale it was almost translucent. A network of clear tubes connected her to the machines that were currently doing the work her heart couldn't manage on its own. Rose sat in the vinyl chair by the bed and took Chloe's small, limp hand in hers. This was the reason a shouting mob boss didn't scare her. This was the why behind the ice in her veins. When you spend your mornings discussing mortality rates with surgeons, and your nights calculating how many shifts it takes to pay for a single vial of specialized medication, a man throwing a glass of wine seems like a child having a tantrum. A soft knock at the door made Rose turn. A nurse, Sarah, stood there with a sympathetic smile and 2 cardboard cups of lukewarm cafeteria coffee. She handed one to Rose and sat on the edge of the guest cot. "She had a good afternoon," Sarah whispered. She ate some of the gelatin and asked if you were bringing her any stories about the grumpy dragon at the restaurant. Rose managed a small, tired smile. "The dragon was especially loud tonight. He started asking questions, Sarah. He noticed the bruise on my wrist from when I caught Chloe during her last dizzy spell. He's observant," Sarah noted, her eyes shifting to the thick stack of medical bills sitting on the bedside table. "The billing department called again today, Rose. They were saying the experimental treatment needs to be paid up front starting next month. The insurance appeal was denied. Again." Rose felt a familiar tightness in her chest, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. The amount they needed was $40,000. It might as well have been 40 million. She looked at her daughter's peaceful face and felt a surge of desperate, protective rage. She was a waitress at a high-end steakhouse. She was smart, she was efficient, and she was hardworking, but none of those things were enough to fix a faulty heart valve in a city that ran on paper and ink. "Find it," Rose said, her voice a low, hard vowel. "I'll pick up double shifts. I'll work the private parties in the cellar. I'm not letting them stop the treatment." "You're already working 80 hours a week," Sarah said softly. "You're running on fumes, even with the tips from the dragon." "The math doesn't add up." Rose didn't answer. She knew the math. She lived the math every time she opened her bank app. She stayed in the room until the sun began to peek over the city skyline, painting the hospital room in shades of gray and pale gold. She kissed Chloe's forehead, whispering a promise to be back before dinner, and headed out to start the cycle all over again. She walked back to her apartment to change, the city waking up around her. The streets were filled with people heading to office jobs, their lives occupied by small stresses like traffic or missed meetings. Rose felt like she was moving through a different dimension, a darker world where the stakes were life and death. Inside her small kitchen, she opened a drawer and pulled out a hidden envelope. Inside were the business cards of 3 different payday loan centers and a single, heavy card embossed with a gold crest that she had found tucked into her tip folder the night before. It didn't have a name, just a phone number and an address for a private club called the Obsidian. She knew it was Marco Bellini's private territory. She also knew that a man like Marco didn't give out his personal contact information to waitresses unless he wanted something. In the light of the morning, the card felt cold in her hand. The fearlessness Rose showed at the restaurant wasn't a choice. It was a side effect of exhaustion. When you are already drowning, you don't worry about the rain. She looked at the photo of Chloe on the refrigerator, a picture taken a year ago before the hospital gowns and the monitors, when her daughter was laughing in a park. Rose tucked the gold-crested card into her pocket. The dragon was dangerous, she knew that. He was a predator who lived by a code of violence and absolute loyalty. But he had money, and he had power, and he had looked at her like she was the first person in years who had dared to tell him the truth. If the world was going to demand $40,000 to keep her daughter's heart beating, Rose would walk into the mouth of the furnace to get it. A mob boss temper was a small price to pay. She stood at the window, watching the luxury cars begin to line up in the Gold Coast district below. Somewhere in one of those penthouses, Marco Bellini was waking up, a man who could change her life with a stroke of a pen. Rose smoothed her hair, tied her braid tight, and prepared for her shift. She wasn't afraid of the predator anymore. She was starting to wonder if the predator was exactly what she needed. The Tuesday night shift at the Iron Pedal began with a heavy, unnatural stillness. The usual hum of jazz and the clinking of silverware were absent, replaced by a tension that made the air feel thick and electric. Rose was setting the tables near the back when the front windows shattered. It happened in a heartbeat. A black SUV screeched to a halt outside, and a volley of bricks and heavy iron pipes tore through the expensive glass. Customers screamed, diving under mahogany tables as glass rained down like jagged diamonds. Two men in hooded sweatshirts stepped through the wreckage brandishing baseball bats. They weren't there to rob the place. They were there to send a message. They began systematically smashing the display cases of rare vintage wines, the very bottles Rose had meticulously handled nights before. Rose didn't scream. She didn't hide. She moved toward the kitchen doors, her first instinct to guide the younger busboys to safety. But before she could reach the handle, the front doors were kicked open with a force that made the remaining glass rattle in its frames. Marco Bellini stepped into the chaos. He wasn't shouting this time. He was terrifyingly quiet. Behind him were four men in dark suits, their faces like stone. Marco didn't look at the vandals. He looked at the wreckage of the restaurant, his eyes traveling over the ruined leather booths until they found Rose standing near the center of the room. The two men with bats froze. They knew who he was. One of them shifted, raising his bat as if to strike, but Marco's lead enforcer was faster. A single heavy blow sent the man to the floor. Marco walked over to the second man, who had dropped his bat in a desperate show of surrender. Marco grabbed him by the throat, lifting him until his toes barely touched the floor. "You chose the wrong night to make a mess in my city," Marco said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He threw the man toward his guards like he was discarding trash. "Clean this up and find out who sent them." Restaurant was a disaster zone. Leo was weeping near the host stand, looking at the thousands of dollars in ruined wine. Marco ignored him and walked straight to Rose. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his shadow falling over her red and white striped uniform. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His hands reached out, hovering near her shoulders as if checking for invisible wounds. "I'm fine," Rose said, though her voice was brittle. The adrenaline was finally starting to fade, replaced by the crushing realization that the restaurant would be closed for weeks. If the restaurant was closed, there were no shifts. If there were no shifts, there was no money for Chloe's treatment. Marco saw the shift in her expression. He saw the way her eyes darted toward the exit, calculating the loss. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. "I know about the hospital, Rose. I know about the $40,000 you need by the end of the week." Rose froze. The air left her lungs. "How?" "I told you I was curious," Marco said. "I don't leave things to chance. I've already settled the debt with the billing department. Your daughter's surgery is fully funded. The experimental treatments are paid for the next 6 months. Rose felt a wave of dizziness so strong she had to reach out and grab the edge of a table to stay upright. Relief and terror fought for space in her chest. "Why?" "I can't pay you back. I'm a waitress, Marco. I don't have anything you want." "You have exactly what I want," Marco replied, his charcoal eyes locking onto hers. "You have a spine made of steel and a mind that doesn't cloud under pressure. But those men tonight, they weren't just hitting a restaurant. They were hitting my interests. And because I've taken an interest in you, you are no longer safe in that apartment on the edge of town. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Consider this a protection contract. I've cleared your debt, but in exchange, you're coming with me. You're going to help me manage the legitimate side of my holdings, the estates, the events, the things my men are too blunt to handle. You'll have a salary, you'll have security, and you'll have a room in my penthouse where no one can touch you." "Can't just leave my life," Rose argued, though it felt weak even to her. "Your life is currently a series of double shifts and debt collectors," Marco countered. "I am offering you a throne in exchange for your service. My car is outside. Your daughter is being moved to a private suite at the hospital with 24-hour security. You can see her every day, but you won't sleep in that apartment tonight." Rose looked at the shattered glass on the floor, the wreckage of the only world she knew. She thought of Chloe's heart, the fragile rhythm that was now bought and paid for by the man standing in front of her. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a piece on a much larger, much more dangerous chessboard. "What happens if I want to leave?" she asked. Marco's dark, dangerous smile returned, the one that suggested he already knew the answer. "Then you leave. But I think you'll find that once you've tasted the view from the top, the street level feels very crowded." He didn't wait for her to agree. He reached out and took her hand, his large, warm palm swallowing hers. He led her through the broken glass and out into the cool night air where a line of black cars waited. As the door of the lead SUV opened, Rose looked back at the iron pedal one last time. She was stepping out of the eye of the hurricane and into the heart of the empire. She knew the cost of her daughter's life was her own freedom, but as she sat down in the plush leather interior of Marco's car, she realized she had never felt more powerful. The predator had just claimed her debt. He had claimed her. And as the car sped toward the glittering lights of the Gold Coast penthouses, Rose realized she wasn't just surviving the storm anymore. She was becoming part of it. The transition from the frantic humidity of a restaurant kitchen to the hushed, marble-lined corridors of Marco Bellini's primary estate was jarring, but Rose adapted with the same mechanical efficiency she had used to survive her double shifts. She no longer wore the red and white striped apron. Instead, she moved through the sprawling penthouse in tailored charcoal slacks and silk blouses that felt like a second skin. Her new role was officially titled Executive Administrator, but within the first week, she realized her job was to be the conscience and the calculator that Marco's organization lacked. While his enforcers understood the language of broken bones and intimidation, they were useless when it came to the intricate web of shell companies, high-end real estate holdings, and charitable foundations that kept the Bellini empire afloat in the legitimate world. The first test came during a Tuesday morning meeting in the glass-walled boardroom that overlooked the Chicago skyline. Marco sat at the head of the table, his tattooed hand steepled in front of him, listening as his lead logistics manager, a burly man named Rocco, explained a massive shortfall in the construction of a new luxury hotel. "Union reps are squeezing us, boss," Rocco growled, slamming a folder onto the table. "They want another 10% on the concrete contract or they walk. I say we send the boys down to the site tonight and remind them who owns the dirt they're standing on." Other men around the table nodded, their faces darkening with the easy, violent reflex they had used for decades. Marco didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the corner of the room where Rose was quietly reviewing a stack of invoices. "Rose," Marco said, his voice cutting through the heavy tension. "Rocco wants to break some kneecaps." "What do you want to do?" Rose didn't look up from her papers for a moment. She made a final note with her pen and then turned her gaze toward the table. The men shifted uncomfortably. They still didn't know what to make of the waitress who had appeared in their inner sanctum. "If you send the boys to the site, you trigger a federal investigation into the union's safety protocols," Rose said, her voice flat and unimpressed. "The construction halts for 6 months, the bank pulls the bridge loan, and you lose $40 million in projected revenue. It's a primitive solution to a mathematical problem." Rocco scoffed, his face flushing a deep purple. "And what's your solution, Red? We just pay them." "No," Rose replied, standing up and walking toward the table. She slid a single sheet of paper toward Marco. "I looked into the union president's personal holdings. He's been skimming from the pension fund to pay for his daughter's equestrian career in Kentucky. He doesn't need a visit from the boys. He needs to know that I've already sent a copy of these bank statements to an anonymous tip line at the IRS, and that I have the power to recall that email within the next 10 minutes. The room went silent. Marco picked up the paper, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face as he read the numbers. He looked at Rocco, who was staring at Rose as if she had just performed a magic trick. "She didn't use a bat, Rocco," Marco whispered, his eyes locked on Rose. "She used a spreadsheet, and she just saved us $5 million and a prison sentence." He signaled for the men to leave. They filed out in a stunned quiet, leaving Rose alone with the man who had bought her life. Marco stood up and walked around the table, stopping just inches from her. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something sharper, filled her senses. "Colder than I thought," he said, his voice dropping to that low hum that always made the hair on her arms stand up. "Most people would have been disgusted by the pension fraud. You just used it as leverage." "I don't have the luxury of disgust," Rose replied, meeting his gaze. "I have a daughter in a hospital bed who needs the best doctors in the country. My morality is tied to her survival. That means I have to be smarter and more ruthless than the men you pay to be violent. Then that's what it'll be." Marco reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. It was a gesture of possession, but there was a new level of respect in his touch. "They're afraid of you now. They don't understand how someone so small can be so immovable." "They're afraid because they can't intimidate me," Rose said. "I've lived through real fear, Marco. Your world is just noise. Once you realize that, it's easy to control." Over the next few weeks, Rose became the silent architect of his most difficult deals. She negotiated land acquisitions, settled disputes with city officials, and reorganized the payrolls of his legitimate businesses. She worked 18-hour days, moving between the penthouse office and Chloe's hospital room. She saw her daughter every evening. The girl was looking better. The color had returned to her cheeks, and the doctors were optimistic about the upcoming surgery. Every time Rose looked at the monitors, she reminded herself that the blood money was the only thing keeping the heart beating. But as her power grew, so did the target on her back. One evening, as she was leaving the hospital, she noticed a silver sedan following her car at a distance. It wasn't one of Marco's security vehicles. She didn't panic. She didn't call Marco to complain. Instead, she took a photo of the license plate and sent it to her own private contact, a low-level city clerk she had recently helped with a gambling debt. When she arrived back at the penthouse, she walked into Marco's study where he was pouring a drink. She didn't tell him she was scared. She simply handed him a slip of paper with a name and an address. "Someone from the Morty family is following my car," she said, her voice as calm as if she were announcing the weather. "I've already frozen their primary shipping account through a loophole in their maritime insurance. They'll be bankrupt by Friday unless they pull their man back." Marco stopped mid-pour, the crystal decanter hovering over the glass. He looked at the paper, then at the woman standing before him in her crisp silk blouse. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a waitress from a storm. He had invited a different kind of storm into his home, one that was quiet, brilliant, and utterly lethal. "You didn't even ask for my help," Marco said, a trace of wonder in his voice. "I don't need help, Marco," Rose said, turning toward the door. "I need results, and I've already secured them." As she walked away, she heard the sound of his glass hitting the desk. She was no longer just a protected asset. She was becoming the brain of the Bellini empire, and for the first time, Marco Bellini wasn't sure if he was the one in control. The invitation to the Founders Gala arrived not on paper, but in the form of a black silk gown delivered to Rose's quarters, accompanied by a set of emeralds that looked like frozen drops of the deep sea. Marco didn't ask her to attend. He simply told her the car would be ready at 7. To the outside world, this was a high society charity event at the Art Institute, a place of champagne and string quartets. In the underworld, it was a neutral ground where the city's predators wore tuxedos to hide their claws. As they stepped out of the limousine, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi caught the sharp contrast between them. Marco was a mountain of dark energy, his tattoos barely contained by the crisp lines of his midnight blue suit. Beside him, Rose moved with a quiet, lethal grace. She didn't look like a waitress or even an administrator. She looked like a secret that everyone was desperate to overhear. "Stay close to me," Marco whispered, his hand firm on the small of her back. "These people smile while they look for a place to twist the knife. Most of the men in this room owe me money, and most of the women want to be in your position." "Not worried about their smiles, Marco," Rose replied, her voice barely a murmur. "I am looking at their hands." The ballroom was a sea of velvet and gold, filled with the city's elite, judges, developers, and the aging heads of rival syndicates. For the first hour, Marco paraded her through the crowd. He introduced her as his consultant, enjoying the confused, wary looks on the faces of his associates. They saw a beautiful woman on his arm and assumed she was a decorative trophy. They spoke over her, discussing zoning laws and shipping routes, assuming her mind was occupied with the weight of her jewelry. But Rose was doing what she had always done at the Iron Pedal. She was taking orders and reading the room. She wasn't blinded by the glitter. While Marco engaged in a tense conversation with a city councilman, Rose drifted toward the periphery, her eyes scanning the faces like she was checking a reservation book. She watched the way the wife of a major shipping magnate kept glancing at the waiter's tray, her hands trembling with a telltale withdrawal. She noticed the nervous sweat on the brow of the district attorney as he spoke to a man known for running the city's illegal gambling dens. She saw the subtle, frantic exchange of a ledger between two rival underbosses in the shadow of a marble pillar. "You look bored," a voice said beside her. Rose turned to see a man in his 60s, his hair silver and his eyes sharp. It was Julian Morty, the patriarch of the family that had been following her car only weeks ago. He looked at her with a condescending smirk, the kind of look a man gives a bird in a cage. "It's a beautiful event, Mr. Morty," Rose said, her tone perfectly neutral. "Marco has a penchant for finding pretty things," Morty said, sipping his gin. "But pretty things usually break when the wind changes." "Tell me, does he treat you well, or are you just waiting for the door to be left unlocked?" Rose didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her sparkling water and looked him directly in the eye. "I think you're more concerned with your own locks, Julian. I noticed your son isn't here tonight. Probably because he's currently in a private meeting in the West Loop trying to settle the $30 million shortfall in your maritime insurance. The one that was frozen last Friday." Morty's smirk vanished. He nearly choked on his drink, his face turning a mottled gray. "How do you know about that?" "I don't just carry the bag, Mr. Morty. I balance the books," Rose said, stepping closer so her voice wouldn't carry. "And if I were you, it'd stop looking at me like a trophy and start wondering why your lead auditor just spent 20 minutes in the coach room with a federal informant. He's wearing a blue tie. You might want to handle that before the dessert course." She turned and walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing frozen in the middle of the crowded floor. She navigated back toward Marco, who was finishing his conversation. He looked at her, his charcoal eyes tracking her movement with a mixture of pride and something that looked like genuine affection. "What did you say to Morty?" Marco asked as she reached his side. "He looks like he's seen a ghost." "Just gave him some free consulting," Rose said. "He was under the impression that the women in this room only listen to the music. I reminded him that we're the ones who keep the rhythm." Marco laughed, a low, genuine sound that drew eyes from across the room. He pulled her closer, his thumb grazing the silk of her dress. "You're a terrifying, Rose. You realize that, don't you? My men think you're a witch, and my enemies think you're a ghost." "I'm just a mother with a high overhead, Marco," she replied, her gaze softening for a fleeting second. "But tonight I realized something else. All these people, the judges, the bosses, the millionaires, they aren't powerful. They're just terrified of losing what they have. They're all wearing masks, but they've forgotten that the velvet is thin." "What about your mask?" Marco asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I took mine off the day I walked into your hurricane," Rose said. "I don't need a mask anymore. I have you." As the orchestra began a slow, sweeping waltz, Marco led her onto the dance floor. For the rest of the night, Rose didn't just feel like a guest. She felt like the eye of the storm. She watched the room, nodding every secret, every weakness, and every hidden alliance. She was no longer just surviving the underworld. She was mapping it, and as she leaned her head against Marco's shoulder, she realized that the velvet mask of high society was a far easier game than the one she had played at table 44. She was the one holding the cards now, and the city was finally starting to play by her rules. The heavy silence of the penthouse at 3 in the morning was different from the silence of the hospital or the restaurant. It was a silence charged with the weight of secrets and the low hum of high-end security systems. Rose was still awake, draped in a silk robe, sitting at the mahogany desk in the library. She was cross-referencing the shipping manifests from the Morty accounts against Marco's internal ledgers, her mind ticking through the numbers like a clock. A muffled sound from the hallway made her freeze. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic step of the night guards or the confident stride of Marco returning from his late-night rounds. It was the hushed, urgent tone of voices coming from the small terrace just outside the library's French doors. Rose stood up, her bare feet silent on the thick Persian rug. She didn't turn on the lights. She moved toward the heavy velvet curtains, pressing her back against the cold stone of the wall. Through the slight gap in the door, she recognized the voice immediately. It was Rocco, the logistics manager who had wanted to break kneecaps at the construction site. "He's lost his edge, I am telling," hissed, the glow of a cigarette ember reflecting in the glass. "He's spending half his time at the hospital or playing house with a waitress. The Mortys are offering us a seat at the table once he's out of the way. The hit is set for the gala's after party at the Drake." "What about the girl?" another voice asked. Rose recognized it as Benny, one of the younger enforcers Marco had personally mentored. "She's smarter than she looks. She's already frozen the Morty accounts once." "The girl is a liability," Rocco growled. "When the smoke clears, she goes with him. We can't have someone who knows the book's left breathing. Once Bellini is gone, the heart treatment stops, the doctors go away, and she becomes a footnote. It's better for everyone." Rose felt a coldness settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the night air. This wasn't just about a mob war or a change in leadership. This was a direct threat to the heartbeat she had sacrificed everything to protect. If Marco died, Chloe's world died with him. The private suites, the experimental surgeons, the 24-hour protection, it would all vanish into the hands of men like Rocco, who viewed people as inventory to be liquidated. She waited until the footsteps retreated down the hall before she moved. She sat back down at the desk, her hands resting on the cool surface. For the first time since she had entered this gilded world, she faced a choice that wasn't dictated by survival, but by loyalty. She could take the information she had gathered, pack a bag, and try to disappear before the strike. She had enough leverage on the Morty accounts to perhaps buy her way into a new life in a different city. She could walk away from the violence and the dragon who had claimed her. But as she looked at the empty glass of whiskey Marco had left on the side table earlier that evening, she realized she wasn't just protecting a debt anymore. She remembered the way he had looked at her during the gala, not as a trophy, but as a partner. She remembered the thumb grazing her jaw and the way he had stepped between her and the glass shatterers at the restaurant. Marco Bellini was a violent man, a predator who ruled by fear, but he had kept every single word of his promise to her. He had given her daughter a chance, and he had given Rose a seat at the table. She picked up her phone and stared at the screen. She didn't call the police, and she didn't call a moving company. Instead, she opened a secure, encrypted messaging app she had set up for the business accounts. She began to type, her fingers moving with a cold, focused precision. She didn't just write a warning, she wrote a counteroffensive. She mapped out exactly which accounts Rocco had been using to funnel the Morty kickbacks. She identified the safe houses where the hitmen were likely staging. She dissected the betrayal with the same clinical detachment she used to analyze a bad wine vintage. She was about to hit send when a shadow fell across the desk. She didn't jump. She didn't even gasp. She looked up to see Marco standing in the doorway, his coat thrown over one shoulder, his dark hair disheveled. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been a month ago. "Still up," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The hospital called. Chloe's vitals are stable. They're moving the surgery up to Friday morning." News should have been a relief, but in the context of what she had just heard, it was a death sentence. Friday was the night of the Drake after party. Marco, Rose said, standing up. She walked over to him, stopping just outside the circle of his personal space. We need to talk about Rocco, and we need to talk about why the Morty family thinks they can buy your life for the price of a concrete contract. Marco's expression didn't change, but his eyes turned to Flint. He didn't ask her how she knew. He didn't question her. He simply stepped closer, his presence filling the room. Deciding whose side you're on, Rose, he said. It wasn't a question. I decided that the night I took your table, Rose replied. I am on the side of the people who keep their word. Rocco is a traitor, and if you don't act by dawn, neither of us will see that surgery on Friday. She handed him the phone. Marco read the messages, the glow of the screen illuminating the tattoos on his neck. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked at her, and for a moment the predator was fully present, lethal, focused, and utterly merciless. If I do this, Marco whispered, there's no going back. You're not just a consultant anymore, you're a part of the blood. Been covered in blood since the day I realized I had to save my daughter alone, Rose said. Just make sure you don't miss. I have a surgery to attend. Marco reached out, his hand cupping the back of her head, pulling her forehead against his. It was a silent pact, a vow of mutual survival. The whispers of treason had been silenced by a louder truth. The waitress hadn't just saved his life. She had become the only person he could trust with it. As Marco walked out of the room to wake his loyalists, Rose sat back down. She picked up her pen and went back to the ledgers. The storm was coming, but she was no longer afraid of the wind. She was the one directing the lightning. The lobby of the Drake Hotel was a cathedral of gold leaf and white marble, teeming with the city's most powerful people. Yet Rose felt as though she were walking through a graveyard. Every tuxedoed man and every woman in silk was a potential ghost. Beside her, Marco was a pillar of absolute, terrifying calm. He had spent the morning purging his inner circle with a silent, surgical precision that Rose had only ever read about, but the primary threat, the hit scheduled for the after-party, was still a live wire. You should have stayed at the hospital, Marco murmured, his hand resting on the small of her back. His touch was warm, a sharp contrast to the predatory stillness of his gaze. The surgery starts in 4 hours. You don't need to be in the line of fire. If I'm not here to read the room, there won't be anyone left to take me to the hospital, Rose replied. She wore a deep crimson gown that matched the velvet curtains of the ballroom, her hair pinned up to reveal the pulse point in her neck. She looked like a queen, but her mind was still that of a waitress, watching the peripheries, counting the exits, and noting the subtle shifts in the staff's behavior. The gala after-party was held in a private lounge on the penthouse floor, accessible only by a single gold-plated elevator. As they stepped out, Rose immediately felt the change in pressure. Rocco was there, standing near the bar with a glass of scotch, his eyes darting toward the service entrance. He didn't know that Rose had overheard him. He didn't know that the waitress had already dismantled his backup plan. The Mortys are in the corner booth, Rose whispered to Marco as they moved through the crowd. Julian is sweating. He hasn't touched his drink, and look at the security by the kitchen. Those aren't hotel staff. They're standing too straight and their jackets are tailored for holsters, not service. Marco didn't nod, but she felt his muscles tighten under his suit. I see them. The elevator is blocked. They're going to try to bottle us in here. Not if we change the map, Rose said. She drifted away from Marco, moving with a practiced, harmless grace toward the service corridor. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman seeking a quiet moment or a powder room. In reality, she was heading for the breaker room she had located on the hotel's blueprints that afternoon. She knew that in a city built on shadows, the person who controlled the light held the power. She found the service door propped open with a linen crate. Inside, the hallway was narrow and smelled of floor wax. She saw a man in a waiter's jacket standing by the electrical panel, a silenced pistol tucked into his waistband. He wasn't looking for a woman in a red gown. He was looking for Marco Bellini. "Excuse me," Rose said, her voice dripping with a fake high-society helplessness. "I seem to have lost my earring. It's an emerald. Could you help me look?" The man turned, his hand instinctively moving toward his waist. But when he saw Rose, small, elegant, and seemingly terrified, he hesitated. It was the same mistake everyone made. They saw the pretty thing and forgot about the iron underneath. As he stepped toward her, Rose didn't scream. She didn't run. She reached for the heavy brass fire extinguisher mounted on the wall and swung it with every ounce of desperate strength she possessed. The heavy metal connected with the side of his head with a dull thud. He went down without a sound. Rose didn't waste a second. She stepped over him and reached for the main power lever. She waited, her heart counting down the seconds. At exactly 11:15 p.m., the time Rocco had specified for the strike, she threw the switch. The Drake Hotel penthouse plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. In the lounge, the music died. The terrified gasps of the elite filled the void. But in the dark, Rose knew exactly where Marco was. She had memorized the floor plan. She moved back into the room, her hand sliding along the wall until she felt the familiar texture of Marco's wool suit. "Service stairs," she whispered into his ear. "Go now. My contact has the door held open at the bottom." "Rocco," Marco's voice was a low growl in the blackness. "I've already handled the lights. The Mortys are blind and Rocco's men are tripping over the furniture. This is your exit, Marco. Take it." They moved through the chaos of the darkened room. Rose led him through the service door, past the unconscious gunman, and down the narrow concrete stairs. Every floor they descended felt like a mile, the silence of the stairwell ringing in her ears. When they reached the ground floor, they burst through the exit into a side alley where a single black car was waiting, not a limousine, but a nondescript sedan Rose had arranged through her own channels. As the car roared away from the curb, the lights of the hotel flickered back on, but the trap had already failed. Marco sat in the back seat, his chest heaving. He looked at Rose, his charcoal eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound realization. He reached out and grabbed her hand, his fingers trembling slightly. "You saved me," he said. It wasn't a boast or a command. It was a simple, raw statement of fact. They had the elevator, they had the halls. I would have been dead before the lights came back on. "I told you," Rose said, her voice finally starting to shake as the adrenaline ebbed away. "I am on the side of the people who keep their word. Now tell the driver to go to the hospital. I have a daughter who needs to see her mother." Marco pulled her into him, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, protective hunger. He didn't speak for the rest of the drive, but he didn't let go of her hand. As they pulled up to the hospital entrance, the sun was just beginning to touch the horizon. Rose stepped out of the car, her red gown stained with dust from the stairwell, her emeralds glinting in the morning light. She didn't look back at the hotel or the empire they had just narrowly saved. She walked toward the sliding glass doors of the pediatric wing, where the dragon followed her, no longer as her master, but as her shadow. The longest night was over, and as she saw the surgeon walking toward them with a nod of success, Rose realized that she had survived the trap not by being a predator, but by being the only person in the city who knew exactly what was worth fighting for. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, golden bars across the mahogany desk where Rose sat. The clinical, sterile smell of the hospital had finally faded from her clothes, replaced by the faint scent of jasmine and the lingering aroma of Marco's morning espresso. Chloe was sleeping in the guest suite down the hall, her recovery moving so fast the doctors called it a miracle. For the first time in 3 years, Rose wasn't calculating the cost of a heartbeat. Marco entered the room silently. He had traded his tactical gear and blood-stained suit for a simple black sweater, though the dark ink on his neck still served as a reminder of the man he was. He didn't sit. He walked to the window, looking out over the city that had nearly claimed them both 48 hours ago. "The Mortys have retreated to the coast," Marco said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Rocco and his associates won't be returning. The internal audit you started has been completed. The organization is clean, or as clean as it can ever be." He turned away from the glass and placed a thick manila envelope on the desk in front of her. Beside it, he laid down a single, narrow folder. "In the envelope is everything," Marco said, his eyes searching hers. "Your original identity has been wiped. No more debt, no more traces of the life you were running from. The bank accounts are in your name, fully funded, and in the folder," he paused, his jaw tightening. "In the folder is a private flight to Zurich, There's a medical villa there, the best in the world. They're expecting Chloe for her follow-up care. It's a clean break, Rose. No strings, no debt to me. Rose looked at the plane ticket. It was the out she had dreamt of during those long, desperate shifts at the restaurant. It was safety. It was a life where she would never have to look over her shoulder or wonder if the man she served was about to start a war. Letting me go, Rose said, her voice barely a whisper. I promised you protection, Marco replied, stepping closer until he was looming over the desk. The best protection I can give you now is distance from me. You've seen the inside of this world, Rose. You've seen what it does to people. You're too good to be swallowed by it. Rose stood up, the silk of her dress rustling in the quiet room. She looked at the man who had been her predator, her protector, and eventually her partner. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes and the subtle tremor in his hand that he thought he was hiding. He was offering her the world, but he was doing it with a hollowed-out look that told her exactly what it would cost him to watch her walk through that door. She picked up the plane ticket. The paper felt light, almost insignificant. She thought about the restaurant, the Bellini Storm, and the way she had felt when she took his hand in the darkened lounge of the Drake. She wasn't the waitress who had nothing left to lose anymore. She was the woman who had found her power in the heart of the hurricane. Without a word, Rose walked to the small decorative fireplace in the corner of the office. She dropped the flight folder into the low, decorative flame. They both watched as the edges curled and blackened, the promise of Zurich turning into ash in seconds. A guest in this house, Marco, Rose said, turning back to him. Her voice was as calm and immovable as it had been at table 44. And I'm not a debt you need to settle. I've spent my life being moved around by people who thought they knew what was best for me. I am done running. Marco stared at the fireplace, then back at her, a slow, disbelieving hope breaking through his hardened expression. If you stay, you're not staying as an administrator. You're staying as the woman who holds the keys. My men already answer to you. The city already knows your name. If you're by my side, there is no more shadow to hide in. I don't want the shadow, Rose said. She walked to him, closing the distance until her hand rested on the heavy muscle of his chest. She could feel his heart beating, strong, steady, and entirely hers. You rule the streets, Marco, but I know how to rule the people. You need me to keep this empire from eating itself alive, and I need a man who isn't afraid of the ice in my veins. Marco reached out, his large hands framing her face with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone who knew his name. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. They'll call you the Queen of the North Side, he whispered. They'll be more afraid of your silence than my shouting. Them, Rose replied. Fear is just a tool. We've both learned how to use it. Marco crashed his lips down onto hers, a kiss that was a collision of relief, possession, and a deep, soul-level recognition. It wasn't the kiss of a boss and a subordinate. It was a pact between equals. Rose responded with a fierce hunger of her own, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer as if to bridge the gap between their two worlds forever. An hour later, they sat together on the terrace as the sun began to set, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of bruised purple and burning orange. Rose had her laptop open, already drafting a new security protocol for the legitimate holdings, while Marco sat beside her, his arm draped over the back of her chair. The iron pedal was being rebuilt, the glass replaced with something stronger, something unbreakable. But Rose wouldn't be going back to serve wine. She looked out at the glittering lights below, a city that Marco ruled and a city that she had conquered from the inside out. The waitress who had once walked into the tiger's cage with nothing but a decanter and a prayer was gone. In her place stood a woman who had seen the predator's heart and decided she belonged right beside it. Marco Bellini might have been the king of the underworld, but as Rose leaned her head against his shoulder, she knew the truth that the city would soon learn. A king may rule the city, but it takes a queen to hold the empire. And Rose Bennett was finally home.